Welcome to the Death and Disco podcast, where we explore how embracing death can lead to a life of abundance of alignment and radical aliveness. Hello, friends. Welcome to the podcast. I have Sheldon Solomon on today. I am so excited for this interview. I feel like I've been waiting for it forever. So, Sheldon Solomon is a professor of psychology at Skidmore College. His studies of the effects of the uniquely human awareness of death on attitudes and behavior have been supported by the National Science Foundation and Ernest Becker Foundation and featured in the documentary film Flight from Death: The Quest for Immortality. He is co-author of In the Wake of 9/11, The Psychology of Terror and the Worm at the Core on the Role of Death in Life. That's the book that I read, and wow, kind of blew my mind. Sheldon is an American Psychological Society Fellow, a recipient of an American Psychological Association Presidential Citation, a Lifetime Career Award by the International Society for Self and Identity, the Association of Graduate Liberal Studies Programs Annual Faculty Award, and a Career Contribution Award by the Society for Personality and Social Psychology. Damn, Sheldon, you've been busy.
Well, I'm also old, so but thank you, Emily.
Well, one thing that really struck me in your book was like, and we'll dive into all of this in just a moment, but just like how it all matters and it doesn't matter, and
Nice.
how that really impacts your purpose and drive in life. So I'm just curious, what keeps you going? Like, what keeps you motivated? And this is going to get more in. I know we're going to get more into this later, but just like, what's been the drive for you?
Well, I mean, that's a great question. To be honest, I think that early on, I was like lots of people, just driven to be successful in the traditional sense of the word, because as we'll talk about in a bit, self-esteem
Yeah.
is one way to acquire psychological equanimity. But the older I've gotten, I've not completely abandoned that
Mhm.
somewhat egotistical aspiration. But on the other hand, I've become, and you really said it well, I've tried to come to a psychological equilibrium where everything matters and everything doesn't. And so it really does matter that my buddies Jeff and Tom and I wrote the book, The Worm at the Core, and
Mhm.
people, you read it and thought there were some interesting ideas, and I think that's great. And also great on a nice day is getting a face full of fresh air while I walk the dog around the block. And so I really am trying to get to that point where, radical insignificance is
Mm.
just as valuable as trying to inflate ourselves sometimes to superhuman proportions.
Yeah, it's such a hard duality to hold, and I really struggled for a bit when I read your book, and I'm grateful for the struggle because I feel like it kind of broke I broke not entirely free of, like, the ego. I think that's really hard to do, but it just made me really grapple with, like, what is the meaning of life to me, and why am I doing all of the things that I am doing?
Yeah.
And I just wanna thank you because it's true, the contributions do matter, and, like, I have felt so much of what you talk about in terror management theory and the worm at the core, and also your new work around death acceptance. Like, I felt it in my very being, and it's been so hard for me to explain it, and convince other people to try to engage with their mortality because everyone's like, "No, like, I don't wanna go there." So it does matter. It absolutely
Yes.
matters, right? Like, you are creating a ripple effect of impact that has a extreme impact and, um, for people. So thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I'd like to think that we've had an impact of sorts, but in my estimation, equally, if not more important, are folks like you who are resonating to these ideas at the same time trying to disseminate them to a wide
Yeah.
range of people such that they can be applied. The, my wife is a therapist slash grief counselor. My
Mm.
daughter's a therapist. And, my joke is if people are having trouble sleeping, I'll send you one of our experiments and you'll be napping within a paragraph. We're academics and that's important. But right now, I do think, not to sound histrionic or hysterical, but I think humanity's at really a fork in the road,
Mhm.
and the future of our species depends on whether we continue in the direction that too many people are moving.
Yeah.
And that's where almost everything that's unsavory about humans is just a malignant manifestation of death denial.
Mhm.
Whereas on the other hand, everything that brings out the best in us comes from being able to accept our finitude and in so doing bring
Mm.
ourselves to life. And we could talk for many hours if not many decades, but if we had to sum it up in one little fortune cookie like phrase, it really, as counterintuitive as it sounds, it's that, the fullness of life requires an awareness of and acceptance of
Yeah.
our transience and finitude.
I
And
can
that in no way implies that we're not going to be devastated, that we're not going to suffer, as you know from your
Mhm.
own experiences.
Yeah.
But it's through the fortitude, the courage and understanding that comes from just the contemplation of the inevitability of death. And of course, that's not a new idea. It
I
goes back
know.
to antiquity. All of the world's great religions, all of the world's great philosophies, all of the world's great art has always been focused on those ideas. And so here we are, psychologists. We're always the last ones to catch up.
Well, you're getting the evidence to back it up, but it is so funny how these concepts are not new. They've
That's
been
right.
around for yeah, since the beginning of time, right? And I'm glad that we're talking about them because I completely agree with you. I believe that death is the key to living a life of meaning, and I believe that it is like a missing piece and why our world is the way it is. So before we dive into that, because I want to give our listeners just a little bit of context on,
Sure.
um, I want to know like what it was like for you stumbling upon Ernest Becker's work and how you started to develop uh, terror management theory and what it is.
Yeah, sure. Great question. I stumbled on Ernest Becker's work uh, by accident. It was my first week as a professor at Skidmore College in 1980, and I was looking for books by Freud in order to teach a class about personality theory.
Mhm.
And then I stumbled on the bookshelf were two books that caught my attention, frankly, just because of these green colored dots on the paperback version of one of them. And that was called The Birth and Death of Meaning. And right next to that was another book called The Denial of Death, both by
Mm,
Ernest Becker, a recently deceased cultural anthropologist who won a Pulitzer Prize for The Denial of Death in 1974.
mhm.
And so I opened up The Birth and Death of Meaning, and in the first paragraph, Becker says, I want to understand why people do what they do when they do it. I was like, yeah, me too. But finally, you're not like, just using all kinds of clunky jargon. You're just straight ahead saying, I want to understand what's the motivational
Yeah.
underpinnings of human behavior. And he insisted that in order to do that, we're going to have to be interdisciplinary and take ideas from wherever they come. And then I pick up the other book, The Denial of Death, where Becker says in the first paragraph, death, that humans are unique in our capacity for abstract and symbolic thought. And that's awesome. We can imagine things that don't even exist and
Yeah.
then have the audacity to make them real. And then he's like, yeah, and part of that cognitive toolkit is self awareness. We're not only here, but we know that we're here. And then following Kierkegaard, the Danish existential philosopher, he says, look, if you know that you're here, that's both awesome and dreadful. Like it's awesome to be alive and to know it. That's why I'd rather be a person than a potted plant. But it's also dreadful.
Yeah.
And he's like, yeah, if you're smart enough to know that you're here, then you're going to realize that, like all living things, your life is of finite duration and you too will someday die.
Mhm.
Not only that, your death can occur at any time for reasons you can never anticipate or control. And then, like it or not, you're encased in an animal body
Mhm.
that biologically is no more significant or enduring than a lizard or a potato.
Yeah.
And Becker argued that we would all be literally overwhelmed with debilitating existential terror if we didn't have some way to manage it,
Yeah.
uh, which he proposed happens by embracing cultural belief systems, that the ideas that we collaborate in constructing and maintaining that give us a sense of what's happening around us and at our best infuses our lives with a sense of meaning and value.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, I read that and it was literally like on a page, and two things. One is that it struck me in my gut as at the very least a profoundly poignant explanation of my own experiences. I've
Mhm.
been disinclined to die since I was 8, and that was the day that my grandmother died.
Mm.
And I realized later that evening, I was sad and my mom was sad. And yet I'm sitting there and I'm like, oh, wait a minute. If my grandmother died, that means that someday my mom's going to get old.
Yeah.
And then where's the spaghetti and chocolate pudding going to come from? And all right, so that was a bit disruptive, but then after that, I was like, wow, that
Mm.
means at some vaguely unspecified future moment that I too will die, and I that gave me that was my first existential crisis that
Yeah.
I buried under the psychological bushes, literally until almost 20 years later when I saw the Ernest Becker books.
Wow.
And so personally it really hit me as profound. And then just as a scholar, my buddies Jeff Greenberg and Tom Pazinski and I, had just finished our PhDs in experimental social psychology, and we were trying to figure out what are the psychological functions of self-esteem and why is it that people can't get along with other people who don't
Mhm.
share their beliefs about the nature of reality. So I called them up and I said, geez, you got to read these books. And that literally changed the course of my personal life as well as my professional life. The long short story is we thought that Becker's ideas were tremendous and profound, and we started going around North America and Europe, just saying, "Here's what he's saying. This is important." And most psychologists at the time just said that's silly or wrong.
Mhm.
They would be like, well, I don't think about death all the time, so this must be wrong. And we said, well, you don't think about death all the time because you're comfortably embedded in a cultural worldview that gives you a sense of meaning and value. So are we right or are we right?
Right.
And that doesn't make people happy.
No.
And then and then they just said, look, we're academic psychologists. There's no evidence for these ideas. Not only is there no evidence, but it wouldn't be possible to get it because Becker insisted that most of these processes are quite unconscious. And
Mhm.
so we've spent almost well, more than 40 years since then, first by ourselves, then with our students, now with a boatload of awesome scholars around the world, uh, generating a large body of evidence that is consistent with Becker's claim
Yeah.
that our disinclination to die can account for. It has a pervasive and persistent influence on almost everything that we think, on almost everything that we want, on almost everything that we do, whether we're aware of it or not.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with everything that Becker had to say and everything that you guys had to say. And I think the evidence and the tests that you guys did to prove this concept really drive it home. So, can you talk a little bit about some of the I mean, I'm thinking of like the courtroom example or just the
Yeah.
people's destructive behaviors and how our our existential fear on a subconscious and sometimes conscious level like drives human behavior.
Yeah, so this is very good because I think that the folks that are listening and are not familiar with these ideas, they may, for some, just strike you in the gut. It's like,
Mhm.
yeah, I kind of get that. They may seem just quite alien, and that's not an indictment of one's character or
Right.
intelligence. The beauty of science is that, regardless of what we think or feel, it gives us a rather detached and, at its best, objective view of these matters. And
Mhm.
so most of our experiments are based on a relatively simple paradigm in psychobabble. It's called the mortality salience paradigm. And the idea here is that if Becker is right, if our beliefs about reality and if our urge to acquire and maintain self-esteem are in the service of mitigating death anxiety, then what we thought is, well, let's remind people that they're going to die.
Mhm.
And let's see thereafter if that makes them cling more tenaciously to their cultural worldviews and to strive to increase their self esteem.
Yeah.
And so the way that we remind people that they're going to die depends on the experiment. And so in some experiments, we just have people in a lab and we ask them to just write down their thoughts and feelings about their own death.
Mhm.
In control conditions, we ask people to write their thoughts and feelings about something unpleasant but not fatal. So you're in a car accident and they had to cut your leg off. You needed to pull a tooth, but they ran out of anesthetic. You failed a test. All negative things, but not fatal.
Mhm.
So that's one way to remind people they're going to die. Another way that we do it is outside of the lab. We stop people either right in front of a funeral parlor or 100 meters to either side. Our argument being that if you're standing in front of a funeral parlor, death might be on your mind, even if you don't know it.
Right.
And then another blob of experiments back in the lab. We bring people in, we have them read stuff on a computer. And while they're doing that, we flash the word death for 28 milliseconds. It's so fast that you don't even know that it's on your mind.
Mhm.
And so, all of the studies that we're about to talk about, it doesn't matter how you're reminded that you're going to die. For the most part, the same things happen. All right, so back to the original study, it was done with municipal court judges in Tucson, Arizona.
Yeah.
We randomly asked half of the judges to think about dying. The other half, we didn't ask them to think about anything.
Mhm.
And then we just asked them to pass judgment on a moral transgressor. In this case, it was a woman accused of soliciting prostitution.
Mhm.
We did that because that was the most common transgression in the 1980s in Tucson, Arizona, where
Hmm.
we did the study. And and we asked the judges to set a bond. That's the amount of money that you have to pay so you're not jailed until your
Right.
trial.
Right.
And so in the control condition, the judges averaged $50 for the bond. And that was the average bond set in the courtrooms in those days. When the judges were reminded that they were going to die first, the bond was 9 times higher. It was $455. And what was interesting is that when we talked to the judges afterwards and told them what the study was about, the judges, they all of them, they just said, that's ridiculous. There's no way that asking me to think about dying would affect my adjudication, whatever that word is, would
Yeah.
not affect the way that I administer the law. And so my joke is you better hope the judge isn't driving past the cemetery on the way to your next trial. Uh,
Totally, totally.
but then we wanted to be sure that the reactions to death reminders was not just negative. So we did another study where we reminded some people they were going to die and others something unpleasant. And we had them read a little article about a citizen engaged in heroic behavior. They saw somebody robbing a bank and they ran after them and tackled them on the street until the police came. And now the question was, if you could give that person a monetary reward, how much would you give them? And in the control condition, they said, let's give the hero $1,000. When they're reminded of death first, they said, let's give them $3,000. So this is very important. When death is on our minds, it doesn't just make us negative or pejorative
Okay.
about everything. What it does is it makes us respond more negatively to things that are at odds with our worldview and moral values, but it also enhances our enthusiasm and support for those who support our cultural worldviews. Right. So the next round of studies had to do with, well, why do we hate people who are different?
Mm,
And Becker's like, well, I don't want to ruin your day, but if our beliefs about reality reduce death anxiety, whenever you run into somebody different, whether you're aware of it or not, there's a negative reaction because if we accept the validity of somebody else's beliefs, we undermine the confidence with which we subscribe to our own.
yeah.
And therefore, he's like, well, when death is on our mind and we see somebody different, we denigrate them as not quite human. We try to get them to dispose of their beliefs and adopt ours instead.
Mhm.
And if you pardon the profanity, if that doesn't work, just fucking kill them, thus proving that our ideas and our God is superior after all. And so we did a boatload of studies. We reminded in the first one Christian participants of their mortality or not in a control condition. And then we asked them to rate fellow students who either said they came from Christian or Jewish families. And the good news is in the control condition, Christian students rated other Christians and Jewish students equally highly,
Mm,
restoring my faith in humanity momentarily. On the other hand, when they were reminded of death first, they liked Christians more and they liked Jewish people less. And this
mm,
has nothing to do with Christianity. In Israel, Jewish people reminded of death like Jewish people more. And they like Arabs, Muslims, and Christians less. So that basic effect, when death is on our mind, we love people who are like us and we hate and hurt people who are different. That's been replicated in more than 25 countries around the world, suggesting, in our view, that this is not a cultural affectation so much as an innate human predisposition.
right.
All right, then we do another boatload of studies. Um, Becker was interested in how Hitler came to power in Germany,
Mhm,
and Hitler was elected. And what Becker argued is that's because in times of historical upheaval, a guy named Max Weber, a sociologist, said that that's what makes all of us tend to be attracted to what he called charismatic leaders, seemingly larger than life individuals that often proclaim that they're divinely ordained to rid the world of evil.
Mhm.
And so we've done experiments over the last 25 years. Back in the day, right after September 11th, 2001, the day before that happened, George W. Bush had the lowest approval rating of any president in American history. 3 weeks later, he had the highest approval rating.
Wow.
And we thought that was a reaction to death anxiety. Well, sure enough, in 2003 and 4, we did experiments. We showed that in control conditions, people didn't care for George W. Bush that much. They
Mhm.
liked John Kerry more, but if death was on their mind first, they liked Bush more than Kerry. Right, fast forward to 2016.
Mhm.
Well, that's Donald Trump running
Yeah.
for president against Hillary Clinton. In the control condition, Americans liked Clinton a lot more than Trump. But if we reminded them of death first, then they like Trump a lot more. And we can talk more about that at some other time, except to note that Orange Hitler, or Donald Trump, as I would call him, is like all ideological demagogues. They are taking the anxieties and
Yeah.
apprehensions of their followers, and I call them alchemists of hate. They take the fear of their followers and they turn it into hatred by projecting it on to other groups that they declare the all-encompassing repositories of evil, the
Yeah.
eradication of which would make life on earth as it is on in heaven. And I would submit that anyone right now that's paying attention to the news should note how much what we're seeing in the world around us mimics what we're finding in these studies.
Yeah.
Right, then we did a boatload of other studies where we show that when you remind people they're going to die, they deny that humans are animals.
Mm.
They're uncomfortable in natural environments. And then we move on to the why is it that Americans and people all over the world now have an insatiable desire for money and
Mhm.
stuff. John Locke, back in the day, 1690, Scottish philosopher, he said, look, everything in nature is finite. And basically, anything that's natural, there's an upper limit to how much of it we want. Like you
Mhm.
might love pizza, I do, but after 8 or 10 slices, I'm like, oh no mas, I've had enough. Ditto with chocolate. I
Yeah.
love M&Ms, but after I'm using like a snow shovel
Yeah.
to get
Yeah.
a 55-gallon drum of them in my face, I'm like, I've had enough. And so I say to the students at Skidmore, you love chocolate, but at some point you're like, I've had enough. You love beer, but you say, I've had enough. You love sex, but at some
Mhm.
point you say that you've had enough. And the only thing that does not apply to is money and stuff.
Hmm.
And what Becker argued is that whenever there's an insatiable desire, we should think about whether or not that's a defensive reaction to death anxiety. Well,
Yeah.
sure enough, when people are reminded that they're going to die, you say, how much money do you need to feel wealthy? They say they need more money. You remind people that they're going to die, and you say, what kind of things do you want to buy? And they say they want fancy cars or
Mhm.
Rolex watches. When people are reminded that they're going to die, and you just ask them to draw a picture of money, and I think this is amazing. I may even have a dollar. All right, you ask them to draw a picture of money, and they draw a bigger picture as if money gets bigger on your mind. And then the coolest study, we didn't do this, my buddy Tom did with some Polish colleagues. but they just gave some people a bunch of money and they said, hey, we want you to count the money.
Yeah.
Right, but other people, they just gave them pieces of paper and they said, hey, count the pieces of paper. All right, well, you didn't get to keep either the money or the paper. You just had it in your hands for a little bit.
Yeah.
And then they took the money back and they measured death anxiety. Just having money momentarily in your
Yeah.
hands reduces death anxiety. So, anybody who wants to argue that economic behavior is totally rational and is just about the exchange of goods and services, I would
Yeah.
respectfully submit you're totally wrong.
Yeah.
What drives most of our economic aspirations is the desire to not die.
Yeah.
And then one more thing, and I'll shut up, and that's another line of research was how come America and now the whole industrialized world is a petri dish of psychopathology? Why is it
Mhm.
that right now about one third of the people in America are depressed or will be? Why another third are addicted to drugs or alcohol? The other third sitting home, watching 24 hours in a row in Netflix, or they're in their SUV driving to Walmart in
Mhm.
order to buy a chainsaw and a lemon because it's like a nickel cheaper. And what Becker said is, look, when you have a society that is diseased, put a hyphen between dis and eased, and I would
Yeah.
submit clearly ours is. One thing that we need to think about are what are the values that we teach our kids
Mhm.
by which they acquire self esteem?
Right.
And are those values realistically attainable to the average individual? And the point that Becker makes, and it's just as true now, 50 years later, is in America right now, if you're considered a success, you have to, if you're a guy, you have to have either a ton of money or your penis has to be larger than a phone
Mhm.
pole. If you're a woman, then it's even harder because now you're expected to be just as successful economically, but also if you're in your mid or late 20s, you're already ancient. You should just throw yourself in a microwave and turn
Mhm.
yourself into a little desiccated fruit that I can hang from the rear view mirror of my car and so on. I'm being silly, but the point that Becker makes is that we're teaching our children to embrace a set of standards that's not realistically attainable, thus making most of us failures.
Right.
And sure enough, we have since done studies showing that when people are reminded of their mortality, that magnifies all pre-existing psychological conditions. So when people afraid of spiders are reminded that they're going to die, they get more afraid of spiders. People with OCD that are always washing their hands because they're afraid of germs, when they're reminded they're going to die, they use more soap and water. People
Mm.
that are socially anxious, when they're reminded they're going to die, and you give them a chance to just be by themselves in a little closet, they stay there for twice as long, and so on and so forth. And clinicians are now describing death anxiety as what's called a transdiagnostic construct. And that just means that doesn't mean that death anxiety causes all psychological difficulties so much as it has an effect that tends to amplify them.
Mhm.
And so, it sounds kind of, well, it does sound kind of disappointing because by the end of his last book, Escape from Evil, Becker just says, I really wonder if humans are a viable form of life. There was a psychohistorian, Robert J. Lifton, who died a few months ago, And he just
Yeah.
said, We may have the unfortunate, we may be the first form of life to be responsible for our own extinction. Because, at our worst, and let's understand that we're constantly reminded of death. Here we are in the world in the aftermath of the pandemic with a bunch of wars, with economic instability and political polarization and
Mhm.
so on. And based on our research, that literally turns us into depressed, ethnocentric, proto fascists plundering the planet, in pursuit of infinite amounts of money and stuff in a drug and alcohol, TikTok, Facebook stupor. And all right, that's not great. All right,
Yeah.
but let's turn that around though, and let's note that, okay, that doesn't sound great. But on the other hand, at our best, humans have a good track record, have a great track record of extricating ourselves from existential crises if we can truly understand what causes them. So I think the example we use in the Worm book is the plague in the Middle Ages. Well, it killed half of the people in Europe.
Mhm.
And as long as we kept thinking that it was caused by evil spirits, well, people kept dying.
Mm.
But once people said no, it's because of bacteria, well, that led to the development of antibiotics and modern medicine, without which most of us that are here today would not be alive. All right, so by analogy, the hope is that if we can individually and collectively become aware of and receptive to the reality of the human condition, that there are other ways to engage with our mortality
Yeah.
that are not in any way malignant, and in fact, bring out the very best in us.
Absolutely. And so I just want to like synthesize some of this for people who haven't read the book. And because basically what you're saying here is when people are aware or when there's death anxiety, it either amplifies like behavior that's already destructive, and people also cling to their cultural worldviews and this sense of I matter, self-esteem, right, in order to buffer themselves against this existential threat. And I just want to, I guess, define a little bit more for our listeners, like what we mean, what you mean, but Ernest Becker means by cultural worldview in terms of like religion, morals, like what makes the world meaningful, because I think that's what, and again, like I have a lot of followers here who've been through grief and loss, and I remember when my husband died, I went through a little existential crisis because I was like nothing else matters,
That's
nothing,
right.
right? And that's what death does, is it shatters the illusion, the maya that we're all living in around these social constructs that we basically subscribe to unconsciously at birth. And I think what I'm hearing from you is like we need to help people wake up to the fact that they can unsubscribe to these, because that's not really what life is about. And the more that we um just live subconsciously like in this kind of amnesia, we're just going to get more and more divided and want to kill each other, because whenever there's any difference, it's a threat to our sense of what it means to be alive. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, you said it better than me. I like how you put it. So, but again, to reframe, or not to reframe it so much, but
Yeah.
to put it in the context of Becker's ideas, yeah, his argument is that cultural worldviews, he defines as humanly constructed beliefs about the nature of reality that we share with the folks around us, and that it gives us a sense that life has meaning and that
Yeah.
we have value. And
Life has
that
meaning and we have value. I think those are
that
two really important things to just
I
like.
do think they could not be more important. And you can't have value without meaning. And so,
Mhm.
on the one hand, we all need to feel good about ourselves. So, self esteem is something that we all need individually, but it can't be obtained by ourselves totally through ourselves.
Mhm.
And that's why the nature of the worldviews that we subscribe to are incredibly important. And
Right, and
so,
I wanna put it in a little context again,
no,
because I subscribed to a cultural worldview of that I need to, like, earn my worth, right? Like, that I need to be successful, I need to have a six-figure business, a really nice house in order for me to matter, and I think that's what death does, when you engage with it,
that's right.
is it shatters that illusion. But like we are sick as a society because we believe that our sense of worth and why we matter is all interconnected to the cultural worldviews. Whether it's like religious, like I need to be a good person in order to get into heaven, or when it's like it all just is, and no there is like no reality. Like that's what was so mind blowing to me after I read your book,
Yeah.
because I
Or
was
how
like,
about there's a reality, but there's an infinite
right,
variety of ways to apprehend it.
yeah,
And I think that is important. And also important is to note that worldviews differ in terms of their moral and ethical standards. And so, one of the Ernest Becker points was in the Middle Ages in Catholicism, in order to get to heaven, you didn't have to be the richest person. You didn't have to be the
mhm,
best. You just had to be a decent human. Didn't
yeah,
matter if you're the president of IBM or a dipstick for a cesspool. If you were a good person, then you were qualified for literal immortality. We now live in what I would consider to be one of the most malignantly toxic worldviews
yeah,
because of its emphasis on meritocracy, the idea that if you're not the absolute best at what you do, you're a failure. So, a
yeah,
guy, Michael Sandel, in a book called The Tyranny of Merit, he's a philosopher at Harvard, he makes a very convincing case that this produces a culture of misery.
mhm,
Elon Musk is the richest guy in the world. What's he trying to do today? Get more rich.
yeah,
And if you're the second richest, then again, you're a failure. So, what we have got is a society of essentially inebriated rats on a just one of these wheels where they're just running. I
mhm,
got to be better. I got to be better. I got to be better.
yeah,
And that creates a chronic state of
uh-oh.
dissatisfaction. But lots of other folks that are pondering these matters these days. Do you know the book Braiding Sweetgrass?
I've
Have you
heard of
ever heard
it.
it?
Yeah, I have heard of it.
Yeah.
I need to
So
read
there's a
it.
lot of
Write
Robin
it down.
Kimmerer. She's great, and she writes about indigenous
Mhm,
worldviews that are not extractive and exploitative. And so, one dimension to addressing existential discomfort is to reconsider the nature of our worldviews.
yeah,
It does not mean that we need to abandon them. So, for example, the Judeo-Christian worldview
my dog wants to
is,
say hi to you.
"Hey, how are
Wouldn't it
ya?"
just be easier if our lives were just like Miley
Oh,
Rainer, you
yeah,
know?
it would be great. Oh, so anyway, at its worst, the Judeo-Christian worldview is rather unfortunately toxic because basically we're told that when I say we, I mean those of us imbued with testicular fortitude. Guys were created in God's image.
Yeah,
Women are a side dish from a rib,
right.
at least in one part of Genesis. But and then God creates everything else for us. He says he in the Bible we have dominion over everything that flies, everything that walks,
Hmm.
everything that swims. And I think that that's unfortunate because it
Yeah.
detaches us from nature and renders us arrogantly and narcissistically superior to it. However, there are so many different incarnations of the Judeo Christian worldview. St. Francis of Assisi, the last Pope, Pope Francis, no, they're like, no, that's not what is intended. We're not created in God's image to dominate and control. Rather, we're the embodied entities. We're the stewards of the planet.
Right.
It's our obligation to engage with the world around us, not
Mhm.
just to dominate or abuse
Yeah.
it. So that's one angle.
Yeah.
And then the other angle that you mentioned is just, how do we uh, come to terms with the reality of the inevitability of our own death? And here I'm kind of preoccupied with the Martin Heidegger dude, the philosopher in Being and Time, because he writes about it in a very lovely way. He just says that you know that you're going to die,
Mhm.
and that creates a state of what he called angst, which is more than anxiety. He says it's a discomfort where we don't feel like we have a home. Not that we don't live in a house, but we don't feel like we're comfortably situated in our surroundings. And as you mentioned earlier, Emily, when things happen to us, we lose significant others. The planes fly into the
Yeah.
World Trade Center, that literally blows away our culturally constructed view of the
Yeah.
world.
Yeah.
And we are on an existential abyss of sorts.
And
And go.
And this is what is gonna, I believe, heal us. Like, I'm like,
Yes.
I like, and I wanna get into your research on death acceptance and when you get engage with your mortality in a reflective, meditative way, intentional way, right? Because
Yeah.
I think when you can start to see through the illusions and realize that, like, we have subscribed to these narratives, so much of our behavior and our lives is driven from this, and that just because there's differences, like, there are differences and yet we all belong. There is no one way. So can you tell us a little bit more about the research that you're doing in regards to really engaging with your mortality and the positive impacts that you're seeing?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, really good. So let's note that most of our work is on the downside of humankind. So we spent 40 years following Ernest Becker, just trying to show how almost every unfortunate characteristic of human behavior, that death anxiety underlies
Mhm.
that.
Yeah.
And it's other researchers and the,
Oh, okay, sorry.
that and this, no, but the reason why I think this is important is because we like what we've done, but it's not really science till other people engage
Yeah.
with the ideas. And so some of our students, as well as other folks, they were like, "Wow, there must be better ways to manage death anxiety than hating somebody that's different, than
Mhm.
voting for a fascist, than denying that we're animals, wanting to have, insatiable amounts of money and stuff, and following religious and philosophical traditions, in addition to what's now really big in what they call positive psychology.
Mhm.
One line of research that has come out of that has to do with what I consider the tripod of psychological fortitude, and that's awe, humility, and gratitude.
Mm. Mm.
And what some researchers have found is that when we're in a state of awe, which is just defined as the realization that whatever our conception of the world is, there's more to it than that. And
Yeah.
aw's a hard word to define because it goes beyond words.
Mm,
But at our best, we are in awe, whether it's because
yeah.
something great has happened or you're just looking at a leaf on a sunny day with some moisture on it and
Mm,
are just really mystified by that beauty. When people are in a state of awe and then when they're reminded of death, they don't respond defensively. They don't hate people that are different and so on and so forth. And similarly, when people are in a state of humility, and this is hard because in America, humility is seen as something derogatory,
right.
but that has nothing to do with self deprecation. Humility is just recognizing that in the context of the universe, in both time and space, we are radically inconsequential specks of carbon based dust here for a tiny moment before we're summarily obliterated. Now, while that may sound distressing, what Becker says, and based on this guy Otto Rank, is that may sound like, ooh, we're reducing ourselves to something very tiny, but there's more to it than that.
Yeah.
Because think about it. Well, if basically there had to be one form of life to begin with, we don't know how that happened, but there was nothing alive, and then there was something alive. Well, that means that all of us are descended from the first living thing.
Hmm.
All of us are therefore related to, albeit not directly, but we're related to everything that's ever been alive,
Yeah.
that is alive, that ever will be alive. And that at its best gives us a sense of cosmic connection. So,
Totally.
yeah, I maybe am a tiny speck in the overall scheme of things, but I am still intimately connected to all that is. And so when people are humble or when they're in a humble state, the same thing happens. They don't respond uh, defensively when they're reminded of death. And the thing that I try to say to students, in part to remind myself, is when we talk about humility, that doesn't mean that you're not great. In other words, most of us we're not going to be like Einstein or
Right.
Beethoven or Buddha or Jesus. But I like this guy Henry Miller, a dead author of yesteryear, who just said it's not for any of us to judge the effect that we might have, a rippling effect on the world around us. So I may not win a Nobel Prize, I may not be a billionaire, but then again, you know how sometimes you're just walking on the street and you
Yeah.
look up and you're looking at somebody, you've never seen them before, you'll never see them again, but you make eye contact and you just
Hmm.
give a little nod of mutual recognition. Well, maybe that person was about to walk to the nearest bridge and kill
Hmm.
themselves, but
Hmm.
because of the uplifting connection that you made with them, they decide not to. Well, you never see them again, and maybe you even die, but maybe that's the next Jesus or Buddha or Mother Teresa. So, humility does not imply a lack of distinction or a lack of valuable contributions to humanity. All right, and then finally, gratitude.
Mm,
Um, any one of us who slept in a bed last night, any one of us who had a meal this morning, we have a lot to be grateful for. And any in the research that just putting people in a state of gratitude also enhances a sense of psychological well-being.
mhm,
Right, to keep going just a little bit, there's amazing research on the value of meditation.
mhm,
There's amazing research on the value of being actively engaged with nature. There's amazing research right now on the effects of psychedelics that
Well,
uh,
yeah, and just to be clear, you're talking about in relation to death, right? Like
that's
doing
correct.
death meditations, and like I
Yes,
loved the study you sent me on DMT and ayahuasca, and in it kind of creating that NDE state,
that's right.
the or
Yes.
near death experience, and yeah,
Yeah, and what's important, I think, is that all of these things, humility, gratitude, awe, psychedelics, mindfulness, engagement with nature, music,
hmm
they all reduce defensive reactions to
mm,
death anxiety, and they all have the same neuroanatomical pathway.
okay,
And what I like about that is that because what that does is to open the possibility that there's a potentially infinite variety of ways to engage with life in a manner that enables us to accept the reality of our
yeah.
condition, and in so doing, uh, bring out the best in us.
Absolutely. I mean, when I think about my own mortality and after going through my husband's death, like all of those things, awe, humility, and gratitude on the sense of like just really sitting with, wow, like I am here for such a small moment in time, and how magical is it for me to just simply be like alive in a human body, and
Yeah,
just being so blown away by the mystery of it all. And then gratitude, I read about, what is it called, like it's another psychological, like, the subtraction effect or something, and just, after watching someone die and not be able to play with his kids and, like, get out of bed, it's given me so much more appreciation for mine, and I try to remember that every morning it is a gift that I'm wake up and I can see the sunrise, and the humility being like, yeah, I am so small and so significant all at the same time.
there
So
you go.
I guess what's just so frustrating for me as like a practitioner and someone wanting to like have this conversation is, how do you bring down those defenses? Like I was forced into this in a way that I didn't want, and yet
Right.
I had to I had to engage with it in order to alchemize it and heal. But for people who aren't, like, how do you engage them with the conversation before they're like, ah, you know?
Yeah, no, again, I say this anytime I get to talk to folks like you. That's the most important question. And if we could answer it unequivocally, we'd be on the beach chugging rum with our coconuts with our Nobel Prizes. I no, it's ironic. I don't know if it's ironic, but that's the it's one of the things that Jeff and Tom and I have talked about for decades, and that is that sometimes it is important to understand what's happening,
Mhm.
but it doesn't necessarily follow from that where to go thereafter. And that's where,
Yeah.
to get back to what I was saying earlier, I think that it is folks like yourself that are in the best position right now,
Mhm.
again, by virtue of your life experience, which
Mhm.
was both earth shattering, but led to where you now are.
Mhm.
But you also have an amazing background. I've talked to plenty of people who said they read our book and understood none of it. You clearly have a great grasp of these ideas. Yeah, but I don't know,
Mhm.
um, where to go, and
TBD for us to find out, right?
yeah, but this is also one of the things, like, I teach existential psychology, and we read stuff, by Rollo May and Erwin Yalom, and they're existential psychotherapists, and they just said, "Look, there's these universal human concerns, death, um, and then our choices or lack thereof, and then our loneliness or sense of existential isolation, and then meaninglessness, just the difficulty of being able to um, get some sense of meaning from the world or impose it on it."
Mhm.
And they're like, well, we know that everyone that's having difficulties will be struggling in some or all of those dimensions, but it's not like baking a cake where there's a recipe like, oh, I've got to talk
Yeah.
this amount of time about this and this and this. And so, you, as a therapist, you may have someone who's completely perfused and riddled and rattled by death anxiety. And it may turn out that you've had a tremendous effect on helping them without any mention of death whatsoever.
Mhm.
In
Mhm.
other cases, though, it may be that that has to be raised as an explicit concern and examined thereafter.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I really don't know, and it's, honestly, it's one of the things that we're tinkering with in my little lab group, because therapy is obviously important, but a lot of therapy is an exchange of words, and
Right.
my wife was a dance, therapy, that was her background. My daughter was an art major, and she does just as much of her practice is with people like dancing or drawing.
Mhm.
I have some former students that are great therapists, and they do embodied sessions with their clients where they walk outside.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
sometimes there's no talking.
I know.
And
Yeah, it feels like we need to get out of the mind for this, and that's why I was, like, so interested in, like, the altered state work and,
absolutely.
yeah, like, I actually do a death visualization with my clients, and, but it's hard, like, the defenses go up, and so I'm just in the inquiry of, like, what's the best way to
Yeah.
I feel like there's so much medicine in death just, in engaging with our mortality and also just the archetypal energy of, like, release and being in the uncertainty of life and letting go, right? Like, we need to die in order to be reborn, so there's a lot there, but, um, TBD. And I have one more question. Do you have time for it? It's a quickie,
Yeah.
personal one. Just when you think about your own mortality and, like, the point of life now that we have realized that, like, there really is no one meaning, like, what is it to you? What feels like a meaningful life to you?
Wow. I honestly, I gotta go with we may I have to think about that, because, uh, the I and I hate to degenerate to psychobabble, but there's a line of inquiry right now in existential psychology, and it's just called experiential appreciation,
Mhm.
and what the research suggests is that there are some people that have like noble aspirations, and they're always striving for something.
Yeah.
And then there's other people that appear to be enthusiastically and and just ecstatically appreciative of whatever they happen to be doing.
It's beautiful.
And we have a 3-year-old granddaughter, and I would say that this is the same for all little kids. If any little kid who's fortunate enough to be in a secure household environment, they're never bored,
Yeah.
and they seem to be joyously engaged with whatever they're doing. One of my favorite Christmas days was when our kids were like 5 and 2. You have all the gifts and stuff, and they just shredded all the packages and wrapping, and the next thing we know, the gifts were pushed aside and they spent hours rolling around in the pile of boxes and paper. And at first we're like, oh, what are you doing? That's idiotic. And then we're like, no, we're idiotic. Here are folks deriving an extraordinary amount of pleasure from just being, completely enmeshed and engaged with
Mm,
everyone and everything around them. And that's what I think. I'm kind of preoccupied with this notion of a sense of cosmic connection.
yeah.
There's work that suggests that at our best, we're connected to ourselves, connected to those around us, connected to everything, be it our dogs, our plants, or even the rocks and the trees. And that's, I guess, where I would like to strive. And on most good days, um, I think I'm getting there now.
Yeah, it's really hard to unsubscribe to the cultural norms and beliefs that have just in I mean, I hate to say it like this, but, like, intoxicated our ways of being, and you're right, it's like getting back to that childlike nature of just because 'cause they're not aware of, like, what I should be doing or, trying to earn or prove or do all the things, they're just engrossed in life, and yeah, I always think of it as just coming back to my nature, like, just like the trees and the bees and the bunnies, like, they all have their role and I have my role to play too, but they're not trying to be something who they're not, right? It's
That's
just like existing from a place of being and living my purpose from a place of being, and, it's a constant process of just taking off the layers and noticing my beliefs and coming back to my why, and yeah, I
No,
mean
I love that. You said it beautifully with noting that the layers, that's the psychological defenses
yeah.
that we pile on. And I like that analogy. It's the desire and capacity to shred
Mhm.
cultural constructions. And that's not to suggest that they're not valuable and
Right.
necessary.
Mhm.
But they also constrain us, and so
Yeah.
we need to break out.
'Cause it has been hard, like, your book rocked my world, like, I was like, "Wait, like, soul, like, all these concepts that I've been clinging to, right, to, like, help me heal," it's like, "Wait, like, they are just constructs, man-made constructs, and what do I actually believe to be true?"
That's right.
So, thank you for your contributions to, yeah, just psychology and this book, and it's helped me heal, and I hope that we can continue to build like, I feel like me stumbling upon your work was like you stumbling upon Ernest Becker, and I just feel so grateful. So, thank you for taking
Well,
the
thank
time
you.
to chat
My
today.
my pleasure.